Hello, class. Today we're going to talk a little bit about Olaudah Equiano. So, for our discussion, you're supposed to have read the first two chapters of Olaudah Equiano's interesting narrative, as it's called. And this is a pretty important book in the history of African American literature, African literature. And one of the reasons I bring it into this class is because of the role that Equiano played in the literature that we're going to be studying. Now, would it be fair to call him African or African American or Afro British? He certainly would fit more into the Afro British context because he considered himself African, but then also he lived in Great Britain for a good bit of his adult life and died in Great Britain as well. So, because of that, it might be better to fit him into an Afro British context. But at the same time, there's a little controversy about his origin story. Now, in this text was released in 1789 as part of the early abolitionist movement that was really becoming very popular in England. It hadn't quite reached this fervor point, whereas Wordsworth had described it as all of England speaking with one voice, to paraphrase him. That it wasn't quite at that moment yet. However, it was starting to build, and Equiano was part of that building of this movement. And this was one of the first times that a person of African descent was telling about very specific aspects of their lives and having this published. So, what makes his work different than Phillis Wheatley really is the prose form that he's using. In poetry, as we described, and as you know, poetry is generally seen as speaking more from the heart, more emotional, and often vague in specifics and not very direct in what it says. At least some of the older poetry. There's exceptions, of course, but a lot of it is like that. Prose, on the other hand, is more direct. He's trying to tell the story specifically as it is. Would it be fair to call this a propaganda piece by the abolitionist movement? Absolutely. This definitely is. The abolitionist movement was very adamant about trying to get firsthand accounts and examples of people who had suffered under slavery with a specific intent to end it. So this is a rhetorical device that the abolitionist movement is using, and is a specific device that he is trying to employ. So there would be an end to slavery. So Equiano was asked to put this together, and he did. So he put this text together, and we have our interesting narrative. Now, the controversy is, was he actually born in Africa? The book says that he was. His book says that he was born in Africa. There's a scholar, Vincent Coretta, who wrote a biography of Equiano and has pretty definitive proof, or pretty close to fairly certain, that he might have been born in South Carolina instead. So how does this change our story? Not really that much. It changed some of the specifics of it. However, his intent was to be able to push the end of the slave trade, and the story itself would still bring about this. Most of the aspects of the story are things that Equiano would have experienced. Maybe some of the parts that he possibly didn't experience were the ones where he's describing Africa itself. So this is still up for debate, although it's largely being settled. But nonetheless, it's what Equiano presents in this book. How much of it is factual or not, we don't know. But certainly these are the stories of other people too. So it's important to keep that in mind. It's also important to keep in mind that not everybody, when they were telling historical pieces back in those days, didn't necessarily look at history as in the same way that we look at history too. So I'll just throw that out there. But I wanted to add that just in case you go on Wikipedia and you see some line that says that he was born in South Carolina and not West Africa. Like, maybe, who knows? Anyway, let's look at what he wrote, and we'll focus on the writing itself. All right, so there's one important sentence in here that I may have brought up in class, but I wanted to just bring it up again in case I didn't get it. When we look at the narratives of enslaved people in this country, there's often a line that starts off these texts that says, "I was born." I was born in this, I was born in this year, I was born in this city. The importance of this is that it speaks directly to a humanity. And why that seems important, it may not seem as obvious right now, but at the time it did, because not only are you establishing a year, you're establishing a time frame, but then you're also establishing a connection to a humanity that was often denied people of African descent. So to say that I was born puts you into the same category as every other human being on the earth, which was part of and why that was important is because there was a large movement, certainly, to dehumanize people of African descent. And having this one line in here stipulates this part where a connection to every human being, but also a connection to women who often were the readers of these texts. To say that I was born, to bring you back to childhood. So it's a rhetorical device, but it's in almost every major slave narrative. In Equiano's, it's not in the first line. Most of them are in the first line, but it's not in the first line in this one. But it's in later parts. In part 2, he says, I was born in the year 1745. And that was important, for the reasons I just discussed. So what are some of the other things that come out in this text besides the obvious aspect of him being born? In the first couple chapters, what he discusses is what Africa was like. He describes, going to the first line of section 3, we are almost a nation of dancers, musicians, and poets. So what is this when we examine Equiano? When he's saying that we are almost a nation of dancers, musicians, and poets. This is not how Africa was being presented to many people. It wasn't being presented as a land of the humanities. If we said there was a land of dancers, musicians, and poets, you could probably also say the same thing of ancient Greece. You could say the same thing of certain aspects of European society. So he's again, saying that that we are just like you. We are just like you, Europeans. So he's using that, and in that section he describes parts of Africa, but he's adding to this a civilization, if you will. In the next section, in section 4, I'm going to read this one section here. He describes some of the people that were the people that captured slaves in Africa, captured other Africans and enslaved them in Africa. So here's this line. I'm going to read this section. These are sometimes visited by. They were made something like an anchor, but I do not remember either the value or denomination. We also have markets at which I have been frequently with my mother. These are sometimes visited by stout mahogany colored men from southwest of us. They were called the Oye Ibo, which term signifies red men living at a distance. They generally bring us firearms, gunpowder, hats, beads, and dried fish. The last we esteemed a great rarity, as our waters were only brooks and springs. These articles they barter us for odoriferous woods and earth, and our salt of wood ashes. They always carry slaves through our land, but the strictest account is exacted of their manner of procuring them, before they are suffered to pass. Sometimes, indeed, we sold slaves to them, but they were only prisoners of war, or such among us have been convicted of kidnapping or adultery, and such among us, and some other crimes, which we esteemed heinous. The practice of kidnapping induces me to think that, notwithstanding of our strictness, their principal business among us was to trepan our people. I remember, too, they carried great sacks along with them, which not long after I had an opportunity of fatally seeing applied to that infamous purpose. And the purpose is to capture other people, capture other human beings, these great sacks. And one of the reasons why this part is significant is because he taught in this section, Equiano talks about how he was captured. He talks about being captured and the people that captured him. Often Europeans didn't make it into the far inland because it wasn't safe for them. They were easily detected, and they weren't familiar with the terrain. So they often relied on people of African descent to help along with this. But what he did, and this is part of the controversy with Africans who are trading in enslaved people, and this is a big controversy because it goes back and forth, and there's a lot of discussion about this. In fact, if you watch Henry Louis Gates' documentary on this in particular, where he talks about this in particular, he goes back and meets people of African descent who've benefited from the slave trade. And an important distinction here, important thing to note in here, is to say that it was the slavery in Africa was very different than it was with the Europeans. With the Europeans, it became much more of a commercial enterprise versus one that had very strict codes and very strict rules. Mind you, as the European and Atlantic slave trade continued, that this also started to change quite a bit. But at least when Equiano was captured, that there were usually connections with this. Connections to slavery had to deal with crimes committed or people being prisoners of war. And to be fair, in this capacity too, that there are connections with this in pretty much every society that has prisons. The prisons often, have connections to different kinds of what we call slavery now. In fact, even in the 13th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, that it says that slavery is outlawed except for the convicted felons. So which essentially means that that could happen over here, and there are many instances where it did happen here in this country. It's a good book if you want to look into this, called Slavery by Any Other Name. It came out about a decade ago, where it discusses this, the continuation of slavery in the United States. And there's also a documentary, 13th, which discusses it as well. But that aside, so I wanted to mention that because he talks about how they were captured. But he also describes this land in the next chapter, saying that everyone contributes something to the common stock. As we are unacquainted with idleness, we have no beggars. If you've seen any films, it might be films, from the time, are recreating situations, but the descriptions in a lot of texts have to deal with beggars, beggars on the streets. You can read Charles Dickens and find enough of those stories. So to describe a society that has no beggars, then he's contrasting his African society with European society. Deformity is indeed unknown amongst us. I mean, that of shape. Numbers of the native Igbo now in London might be brought in support of this assertion, for in regard to complexion, ideas of beauty are wholly relative. I remember while in Africa to have seen 3 Negro children who were tawny and another quite white, who were universally regarded as deformed by myself and the natives in general, as far as related to our complexions. Our women, too, were, in my eyes at least, uncommonly graceful, alert, and modest to a degree of bashfulness, nor do I remember to have ever heard of an instance of incontinence among them before marriage. They are also remarkably cheerful. Indeed, cheerfulness and affability are 2 of the leading characteristics of our nation. So in that part, what he is, again, contrasting European society with African society, because there was misconceptions of what African society was like, that many times Europeans would look at Africans as being licentious, would sexualize African women in particular, and he's trying to make these contradictions or contrast between this and their views of what African women were to bring up as people. And let me bring up 2 more lines. As to religion, and this in section 6. As to religion, the natives believe that there is one creator of all things, and that he lives in the sun and is girded around with a belt that he may never eat or drink. But according to some, he smokes a pipe, which is our own favorite luxury. They believe he governs events, especially our deaths or captivity. But as for the doctrine of eternity, I don't remember to have ever heard of it. Some, however, believe in transmigration of souls in a certain degree. So in this part, he describes the one part in here, I guess the main part, is having one creator, having one God. This is often seen as something that's very specifically European, even though this goes back to the Egyptians before it becomes something that the Greeks eventually took on. Romans, I should say, eventually took on, and Christians, of course, Christians and Jews to take on as well. So we have a monotheistic faith among his people in particular. So in saying that too, an important part to remember is that what he's describing here is, if you take him for his word that this happened, this is his descriptions, that what he's describing is something that is specific with his group. folks. That because what he's describing with his people doesn't mean that that's the same with other people, and that all African society is how he's describing this in the text. And again, that we put a big asterisk here because we know the controversy going around whether he was born over there, but nonetheless, it's still part of the society. We had a saying amongst us to anyone of a cross temper that if they were to be eaten, they should be eaten with bitter herbs. So he brings out some different flavor of the society, some of the phrases. We practiced circumcision like the Jews and made offerings and feasts on that occasion in the same manner as they did. Like them also, our children were named from some event, some circumstance, or fancied foreboding at the time of their birth. I was named Olaudah, which in our language signifies vicissitude or fortitude, also one favored in having one loud voice and well spoken. So when we see this, a couple things to remember. One is that he's comparing his people and his religion to that of Europeans in one that they would be familiar with, that being with the Judaism. But then also, too, the idea of a name. Most people of African descent, when they were traded into slavery, when they were sold into slavery, that one of the main things that they lost was their connection to Africa, which was most closely identified with their names themselves. There's a famous scene in Roots, the Kunta Kinte / Toby scene, which you may have seen before. If not, Google it and you can find it. But it's part of that, where you have that direct connection with what your name is and what your name means. And in this part, he says what his name is, Olaudah Equiano. He also went by another name, and that was Gustavus Vasa. And this was one of those traditions where a lot of Europeans would name somebody of African descent after either a European king or after a Greco-Roman god. Or in the case of Phyllis Wheatley, after the actual slave ship that brought her to Boston. So the naming of people was very significant, but also just like everyone else, you and me, our names mean something. We were named by somebody who thought long and hard about naming us, and this is part of that long tradition and connection. So in this one, he says that his name actually has a meaning, and that meaning means the vicissitude of fortune, also one favored and having a loud voice and well spoken. So he goes on, he talks in this, and he also goes into the second chapter where he talks more about his actual capture and then his movement into slavery. It's worth reading and going over in detail, because what it does is he talks about how difficult it was not only for him to be captured, taken away from home, he's with his sister, and then also his hope for trying to escape and the difficulty that he found how to escape because of the foreign environment that he was in. Even though he was still within Africa for a large part of this, that he is still within very foreign grounds to him. As you remember from that one scene where we talked about the market, that all they'd seen of the water was little creeks and rivers and streams, so they haven't seen the ocean itself. And for many people, it was a very sublime moment. If you think of the word sublime or what it means, that it's it's a terrible beauty. That it's something that's beautiful to see, but also filled with terror, which anybody who's been to sea, might feel that, at different times. You go to sea and it's really beautiful until things start to get rocky. So I'm going to read this one last section, and this is kind of a letter to a sister. Yes, dear partner of all my childish sports, sharer of my joys, sorrows, happy should I ever esteemed myself to encounter every misery for you, and to procure your freedom by the sacrifice of my own. Though you were early forced from my arms, your image has been always riveted in my heart, from which neither time nor fortune has been able to remove it. So that while the thoughts of your suffering have damped my prosperity, I have mingled with adversity and increased its bitterness. To that heaven which protects the weak from the strong, I commit the care of your innocence and virtues, if they have not already received their full reward, and if your youth and delicacy have not long since fallen victim to the violence of the African trader, the pestilence stench of the Guinea ship, the seasoning in the European colonies, or the lash and lust of a brutal and unrelenting overseer. So in that part, we see a familial brotherly love and tragic sadness with this, with the loss of his sister, and that part is difficult to read, and you can see this in a rhetorical aspect. What he's trying to do, he's trying to stir the emotions of the people that are, that have the ability to end slavery. Maybe not individually as one single person, but as a movement, and that's really what the abolitionist movement was trying to do. And he speaks that directly towards the end of at the end of this chapter. So I'm going to read this one little last section, and that's it. Okay, at the very end of section 2, chapter 2, he speaks directly to the European reader. I'll just read directly. O ye nominal Christians, might not an African ask you, learned you this from your God, who says unto you, do unto all men as you would men should do unto you. Is it not enough that we are torn from our country and friends to toil for your luxury and lust of gain? Must every tender feeling be likewise sacrificed for your avarice? Are the dear friends and relations now rendered more dear by the separation from the rest of their kindred, still to be parted from each other, and thus prevented from cheering the gloom of slavery with the small comfort of being together and mingling their suffering and sorrows? Why are parents to lose their children, brothers, their sisters, or husbands, their wives? Surely this is a new refinement in cruelty, which, while it has no advantage to atone for it, thus aggravates distress and adds fresh horrors even to the wretchedness of slavery. So in that part, Olaudah Equiano is speaking directly to his reader, speaking directly to the Europeans, the English in particular, the Americans, and people that have it in their ability to end slavery. This was a strategic part of the abolitionist movement, and why Equiano's work is so important is because it was one of the first times that people of European descent had actually read the words of somebody of African descent, that they learned about what it was like, that they could sit down and read it. And it makes for the literature very powerful, it makes the literature very powerful, and speaks also to the power of literature, and that you can communicate things that are difficult for many people to conceive of in a way that when it gets too hard for them to read, they can put it down, but when they're ready, they can pick it back up. So this is a voice where he's speaking directly to you. And I say to you in particular, you who are reading this, because while he wrote this for a specific moment, he's also speaking to a lot of people these days who might not have thought slavery was as bad as it was described, might not be able to understand what it was like, and might not understand how painful and how terrible of an institution slavery was, and the long-term damage that slavery did on the ancestors, or on the people that this was inflicted on, and then you can stretch that out further. So with that said, I think it's not wrong to look at this and say that Equiano is not only speaking to his original audience, but he's also speaking to you in particular, to let you know this is what it was like. This is what it was like to be me. And that is, to me, the power of Olaudah Equiano and his very interesting narrative. If you get the chance, I would suggest that that you read the entire text, the entire book. It's not too long. A lot of it has to do with the sea. It's a very religious text. The further he goes along in it, even has a long poem in there where he describes describes his condition. But it's worth the time and effort to read into it. But at the very least, the first two chapters are important, and Olaudah Equiano is important in our studies for this class. All right. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, of course, let me know.